Welcome to Forbidden Lore. Before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was ever placed, before the rise of kings and the writing of history, there was a time that has been almost completely erased from human memory, a time when the earth was not yet ruled by empires, but watched, studied, and perhaps even shaped by beings that did not belong to this world. Ancient myths speak of gods descending from the sky. Civilizations across the globe, separated by oceans and centuries, tell the same impossible story. They describe visitors who came not as conquerors, but as teachers. They brought knowledge that seemed far beyond the reach of early humanity. Knowledge of the stars, of mathematics, of forces that even today remain poorly understood. But there is a question few dare to ask. If the pyramids were not the beginning, then what came before them? Who were these visitors, and where did they go? Or perhaps more unsettling, did they ever truly leave at all? There are structures buried beneath deserts older than Egypt itself. There are maps that chart the stars with impossible precision. There are records that speak of a forgotten age when humans walked alongside something far greater than themselves. Historians dismiss these as myths. Scientists call them coincidences. But what if these fragments are not fiction, but echoes of a truth too vast, too disruptive to be accepted? Tonight, we step beyond the boundaries of recorded history. We follow the traces of a hidden past, a past that suggests that long before the pyramids were built, something else was already here, watching, waiting, guiding, and perhaps preparing us for something yet to come. Long before the first pyramid rose from the sands of Egypt, before the Nile became the lifeline of a great civilization, the earth existed in a quieter, more mysterious age. It was a time untouched by monuments, untouched by written history, and untouched by the certainty that humanity now takes for granted. The world was vast, untamed, and filled with silence. Forests stretched endlessly across continents. Oceans rolled beneath uncharted skies. The stars above shone with the same brilliance we see today, yet to the early humans who walked the earth, they were not distant suns. They were something else entirely, something alive, something watching. These early humans were not yet builders of empires. They had no cities of stone, no temples reaching toward the heavens. They lived close to the land, guided by instinct, survival, and a deep, unspoken connection to the natural world. But even in this primitive state, there were signs that something unusual was beginning to unfold. Strange patterns appeared in the night sky, not the slow, predictable movements of stars and planets, but lights that moved against the natural order, lights that paused, shifted direction, and vanished without a trace. To the human mind of that era, there were no words to describe such things. Only stories, only whispers passed from one generation to the next. They spoke of fire in the sky. At first, these sightings were rare. A fleeting glow on the horizon, a silent streak crossing the stars. But over time, they became more frequent, more deliberate. And slowly, a sense began to take root among these early people. They were not alone. In regions that would one day become deserts, mountains, and ancient river valleys, certain groups of humans began to change. They became more aware, more curious, more capable of understanding patterns in the world around them. They began to observe the sky not with fear, but with fascination. It was as if something was guiding their attention upward. Archaeologists today would one day find fragments of this shift, though they would struggle to explain it. Carvings etched into stone far older than any known civilization. Symbols that did not resemble simple drawings of animals or daily life, but geometric forms, precise, intentional, repeating across vast distances, circles within circles, lines pointing toward the heavens, configurations that mirrored constellations not as they appear today, but as they would have appeared tens of thousands of years ago. How could early humans have known this? This question would linger, unanswered, buried beneath layers of time. But there is another detail, often overlooked. Many of these ancient markings are not found in places of habitation, but in locations that seem deliberately chosen. Remote plateaus, isolated caves, elevated ridges that offer a clear, unobstructed view of the sky. It is almost as if these were not merely artistic expressions, but sites of observation, or perhaps sites of contact. As generations passed, the stories grew more detailed, no longer just lights in the sky, but shapes, structures, silent forms that descended from above and hovered over the land. Some accounts described a low hum that could be felt rather than heard. Others spoke of a stillness that fell over the environment, as if nature itself paused in the presence of something unknown. Animals would retreat, winds would die down, even the insects would fall silent. And then, as suddenly as they appeared, the lights would vanish. For most, these events remained distant, almost dreamlike. But not for all. There were individuals, scattered across different regions of the world, who claimed to have come closer than anyone else. They spoke of encounters, of standing beneath these lights, of feeling a presence that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but something far more complex, observant, analytical. These individuals often returned changed. They began to exhibit knowledge that others did not possess. They could predict seasonal shifts with uncanny accuracy. They understood patterns in the stars that had previously gone unnoticed. They spoke of cycles, alignments, and forces that governed both the earth and the sky. To their communities, they became something more than human, not quite leaders, not quite shamans, something in between. Over time, these individuals formed the earliest foundations of what would later be known as wisdom traditions. Oral teachings passed carefully from one generation to the next, knowledge that was never written down, but preserved through memory, ritual, and repetition. Knowledge that, according to some interpretations, did not originate entirely from human minds. There are modern theories that attempt to explain this sudden leap in awareness. Some suggest it was a natural evolution of the human brain. Others propose environmental factors, changes in climate, or the gradual accumulation of experience. But these explanations, while logical, do not fully account for the precision found in the earliest symbolic records, nor do they explain the consistency of the stories. From regions that had no contact with one another, separated by vast oceans and impassable terrain, similar narratives began to emerge. Beings from the sky, teachers who came in times of need, knowledge given, then taken away, promises of return. It is easy to dismiss such parallels as coincidence. It is harder to ignore them completely. As this quiet age continued, something else began to take shape beneath the surface of human development. Not cities, not yet, but intentions. Plans that extended beyond a single lifetime. In certain regions, groups of people began to gather regularly at specific locations. These were not settlements, but meeting points, places where the sky could be observed, where stories could be shared, where knowledge could be reinforced. And in these places, the earliest forms of alignment began. Stones arranged in deliberate patterns, lines drawn across the alard, markers that corresponded not to the terrain, but to the movement of celestial bodies. These were not random constructions. They required coordination, effort, and a shared understanding of purpose. They were the first steps toward something greater. But greater than what? At this stage, there were still no pyramids, no towering monuments to mark the ambition of humanity. And yet, the foundation for such achievements was quietly being laid. Not through force, not through conquest, but through knowledge. A knowledge that seems to arrive before humanity was ready to fully understand it. And then, something changed. The lights in the sky, once frequent and almost expected, began to diminish. Sightings became rare. The stories did not stop, but they shifted in tone. Where there had once been curiosity, there was now a sense of absence, a silence that felt different from the one before. It was not the silence of an untouched world. It was the silence left behind when something departs. For the first time, humanity was alone again. Or, at least, that is what it seemed. But the knowledge remained. The symbols, the alignments, the oral traditions all persisted, passed down through generations that no longer witnessed the events that had inspired them. Over time, meanings began to fade. Details were lost. Interpretations changed. What had once been observation slowly became myth. What had once been interaction became legend. And yet, scattered across the world, there were still those who believed that this was not the end of the story. They believed that the visitors had not abandoned the earth. They had simply withdrawn, waiting, watching from a distance, allowing humanity to grow, to struggle, to evolve on its own, until the moment was right. And somewhere, deep within these early traditions, there was a recurring idea, a quiet, persistent belief that one day, the knowledge that had been given would be used to build something that would bridge the gap between Earth and the stars. Something vast, something precise, something that would stand as both a signal and a gateway. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the Earth remained without pyramids, without empires, without written history. Only traces remained, traces of a forgotten age when the sky was closer, when the unknown was not so distant, and when humanity may have taken its first steps under the watchful gaze of something far older than itself. And as the stars continued their silent journey across the night sky, one question lingered, unspoken but ever present. If this knowledge did not begin with humanity, then who or what had placed it here in the first place? After the silence came a different kind of presence. Not as frequent as before, not as openly visible, but more deliberate, more precise. As if whatever had once moved freely across the skies of Earth had now chosen its moments carefully. The age of constant lights had passed. What followed was something far more controlled. In scattered regions across the world, under skies untouched by any artificial glow, small groups of early humans began to witness events that could no longer be explained as distant phenomena. These were no longer fleeting lights on the horizon or distant movements among the stars. These were arrivals. They did not fall from the sky like meteors, nor did they burn like fire. They descended slowly, silently, with an unnatural stillness that defied everything the natural world had taught. Shapes began to take form in the darkness above, not random, not chaotic, but structured. Some accounts, preserved through oral tradition, described them as vast and smooth, like polished stone that reflected no light. Others spoke of geometric forms that seemed too perfect to belong to nature. Circles, triangles, elongated forms that hovered without sound. They did not crash. They did not land in the way anything on Earth would land. They simply stopped, suspended between sky and ground, as if gravity itself had been momentarily rewritten. And beneath them, something even more extraordinary began to unfold. The air would change. Those who stood nearby often described a pressure, subtle at first, then undeniable. Not painful, but overwhelming. a sensation that made movement difficult, as though the world itself had become heavier. Time, too, seemed to behave differently. Moments stretched, sounds dulled. Even the rhythm of breath and heartbeat felt altered. And then, from within these silent structures, there were signs of life. Not clearly seen, not fully understood, but present. Shadows where there should have been none. Movements that did not align with the shapes that contained them. Figures that seemed to emerge only partially into view, as though existing between two states. To the early human mind, there was no framework to comprehend this. There was only one conclusion. These were not beings of Earth. Unlike the earlier phase, when the lights had been distant and observational, these encounters carried a different tone. There was intention behind them, a purpose that extended beyond simple observation. They were watching more closely now, studying not just the planet, but its inhabitants. In some regions, these encounters repeated over multiple nights, even generations. Certain locations became known, though never in written form, as places where the sky would open. Sacred ground, not because of worship, but because of expectation. People gathered there not out of curiosity alone, but because something within them recognized the pattern, recognized that these events were not random. They were part of something larger. And slowly, cautiously, the distance between observer and observed began to shrink. There are fragments of stories passed down through countless generations that speak of individuals who did more than watch. They approached, drawn by something they could not explain, guided perhaps by instinct, or by a subtle influence that had not yet been understood. They moved closer to the descending forms. What they experienced would shape the earliest myths of gods and messengers. The beings within these structures did not resemble anything found in nature. Descriptions vary, but certain details remain consistent. They were tall, but not always solid in appearance. Their forms seemed to shift depending on the angle, the light, or perhaps the perception of the observer. Some described elongated limbs, others spoke of smooth, featureless surfaces where faces should have been. There were no clear signs of emotion, no gestures of aggression, but also no warmth. Their presence was neither comforting nor threatening. It was something beyond both. Communication, if it can be called that, did not occur through spoken language. There were no sounds, no words exchanged. And yet, those who claimed to have encountered these beings often returned with knowledge they had not possessed before. Not memories of conversation, but impressions. Concepts placed directly into the mind. Images of stars arranged in patterns too complex to grasp. Visions of structures not yet built. Understandings of cycles that governed both earth and sky. This knowledge did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments, and not everyone who approached received it. Many experienced nothing beyond fear. Some fled, overwhelmed by the presence. Others remained, but returned unchanged. Only a few carried something back with them. These individuals became different in subtle but undeniable ways. They spoke less, but when they did, others listened. They seemed to perceive connections where others saw randomness. They could stand beneath the night sky and trace movements that had no immediate relevance to survival, yet held meaning that would only become clear much later. They began to mark the ground, not randomly, but with intention. Points aligned with the rising and setting of celestial bodies, stones placed in relation to events that would not occur for years, sometimes generations. Patterns that required not only observation, but foresight. It was as if they had been shown something, not the full picture, but enough to begin. Modern interpretations often struggle with these accounts. They attempt to categorize them as early religious experiences, hallucinations, or symbolic storytelling. But these explanations fail to address one critical detail: the consistency. Across vast distances, in cultures that would never meet, similar descriptions emerged. Not identical, but aligned in ways that suggest a shared source. Beings from above, knowledge transferred without words, a sense of purpose that extended beyond the individual, and perhaps most importantly, a limitation. These visitors did not stay. They came, observed, interacted in controlled ways, and then departed, always leaving, never settling, as if bound by rules that humans could not perceive. Over time, a pattern began to form. The visits were not random. They occurred in cycles, long periods of absence followed by brief returns, moments of intense interaction separated by stretches of silence. And within those cycles, there seemed to be an escalation. Each return brought something new, a deeper level of interaction, a greater transfer of knowledge, but also a growing distance. Because as humans began to change, to learn, to organize themselves in more complex ways, the nature of the visits shifted. They became less visible, less direct. The structures in the sky appeared less frequently. The beings themselves were seen only by a few, and the knowledge that had once been given openly now seemed to require effort to uncover. It was no longer simply received. It had to be interpreted, preserved, protected, and in some cases, hidden. There are theories that suggest this shift was intentional, that the visitors, whatever they were, did not intend to remain involved indefinitely, that their role was never to guide humanity directly, but to initiate something, to set a process in motion, and then step back. If this is true, then the question becomes unavoidable. What process? What outcome were they preparing for? Because by the end of this era, one thing had become clear. Humanity was no longer the same as it had been before the first lights appeared in the sky. Something had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to alter the course of development in ways that would only become visible much later. The seeds had been planted. The knowledge, incomplete but powerful, had taken root. And somewhere, within the minds of those who had encountered the visitors, there was an idea. A vision of structures that did not yet exist, structures that would require coordination on a scale never before attempted, structures that would align not just with the earth, but with the sky itself. But that time had not yet arrived. For now, the visitors remained distant, watching from above, returning only when necessary, and always leaving behind just enough to guide, but never enough to fully understand. As the cycles continued, and the memory of direct encounters began to fade into legend, a new question began to emerge among those who still carried fragments of the old knowledge. If these beings had come not to conquer, but to prepare, then what exactly were they preparing humanity to build? Long before the rise of Egypt, before the first dynasties carved their names into stone, there are traces of something older. Not just older in years, but older in understanding. A civilization that should not have existed, not because it was impossible, but because it does not fit within the accepted timeline of human history. For generations, this idea has been dismissed, considered myth, speculation, or misinterpretation of scattered evidence. Yet the fragments remain, quietly resisting every attempt to erase or explain them away. They appear in places where they should not be, beneath layers of earth that predate known cultures, hidden under oceans that were once dry land, carved into stone that has endured far longer than any written record. And in each of these fragments, there is a pattern, precision. Not the rough, survival-driven craftsmanship of early humans, but something deliberate, something measured. Angles that align with celestial events, structures oriented toward points in the sky that held no immediate value for agriculture or daily life. This was not accidental. This was knowledge applied with purpose. There are those who believe that this lost civilization may have been the first to fully receive what the visitors from the sky had to offer. Not just fragments of understanding, but something deeper, a sustained exchange. A period of time when the distance between human and visitor was at its smallest. If this is true, then it would explain what comes next. Because unlike the scattered markings and simple alignments of earlier eras, these structures suggest coordination, planning, a level of organization that requires more than instinct or survival. It requires a system, a shared vision, and above all, a stable foundation. This civilization, whatever its name may have been, did not leave behind written records that we can easily decipher. If they existed, they have either been lost to time or remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered. But what they did leave behind speaks in a different language. Stone, geometry, alignment. Across distant regions of the world, separated by oceans and continents, there are sites that share striking similarities, not in style, but in intention. Massive stones cut with precision that challenges even modern tools. Foundations that remain stable despite thousands of years of erosion, earthquakes, and environmental change. These are not the works of a primitive people. They suggest an understanding of engineering that should not have been possible at the time. And yet they exist. Some of these sites are buried beneath what we now consider ancient civilizations, as if they were built upon something even older. Layers of history stacked one upon another, each new culture inheriting fragments of what came before, often without fully understanding their origin. It is here that the story becomes more complex. Because this lost civilization was not isolated. Evidence suggests that it spanned multiple regions, not necessarily as a single unified empire, but as a network. Groups connected not by roads or written language, but by shared knowledge, shared purpose, and possibly shared guidance. The visitors from the sky, who had once appeared openly, now seem to have focused their attention more narrowly. Instead of interacting with scattered individuals, they may have concentrated their efforts on this emerging civilization, guiding it, shaping it, refining it. But always from a distance. There are indications that the knowledge transferred during this time was more advanced than anything that came before. Not just observations of the stars, but an understanding of cycles that extended far beyond human lifespans. Precession of the equinoxes, planetary alignments, long-term shifts in the Earth's orientation. Concepts that would require generations to fully comprehend, yet appear to have been encoded into the very layout of these ancient sites. Why? Because knowledge alone is fragile. It can be forgotten, altered, or lost. But when knowledge is embedded into structures, into the land itself, it becomes something else. It becomes a message that can survive even when its creators do not. And perhaps that is exactly what this civilization intended. Because despite all signs of advancement, despite the precision and planning, there is also evidence of something else, an awareness of fragility. Many of these ancient structures appear to have been built not just for function, but for preservation. Positioned in locations less likely to be affected by environmental change, constructed with materials that could endure. As if their builders knew that something was coming, something that would not spare them. This idea is not new. Across cultures and myths, there are stories of a great catastrophe, a flood that covered the land, a fire from the sky, a sudden shift that brought an end to an age. These stories are often treated as symbolic. But what if they are not? What if they are distorted memories of a real event? If such a catastrophe did occur, it would explain the sudden disappearance of this advanced civilization. Not a gradual decline, but a rapid collapse. A breaking point from which recovery was not possible. And if that is the case, then the structures they left behind take on a different meaning. They are not just remnants of what was. They are warnings. Markers left behind for those who would come after. Because even as this civilization reached its peak, there are signs that not everything was stable. Some sites show evidence of damage that cannot be easily explained by natural erosion alone. Sudden destruction, displacement of massive stones, layers of sediment that suggest rapid, overwhelming forces. Something happened. Something powerful enough to erase an entire chapter of human history. And yet, not everything was lost. Fragments of knowledge survived. Not in their original form, but carried forward by those who lived through the end. Small groups, scattered and displaced, who retained pieces of what had once been a much larger system. They became the bridge, the connection between the lost civilization and the ones that would follow. But without the full context, without the guidance that may have once been present, their understanding began to change, simplify, transform. What had once been precise became symbolic. What had once been knowledge became myth. And the visitors? They were no longer described as observers or guides. They became gods, beings of immense power who once walked among humans, who brought knowledge and then disappeared. Worship replaced understanding. Ritual replaced function. But deep beneath these changes, the original patterns remained, hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. And as new civilizations began to rise from the remnants of the old, they would unknowingly build upon foundations that were far older than they realized. They would inherit alignments they did not fully understand, symbols whose meanings had been altered over time, stories that had once been records now retold as legend. Among these emerging civilizations, one would stand apart. Not because it was the first, but because it would come closest to reconstructing what had been lost. Egypt. But Egypt did not begin in isolation. It did not rise from nothing. It rose from the echoes of something far older, something that existed before history, something that may have once stood at the center of a connection between Earth and the stars. And as we move closer to the age of pyramids, one question becomes impossible to ignore. If such a civilization truly existed, guided by knowledge beyond its time, and if it was destroyed by a catastrophic event, then who, or what, survived it from beyond this world? After the fall of the forgotten civilization, the world did not begin again in clarity. It began in fragments. Scattered groups of survivors carried with them pieces of something they could no longer fully understand. Not entire systems of knowledge, not complete truths, but remnants. Symbols without full meaning, practices without their original purpose, stories that had once described real events now reshaped by fear, loss, and time. The earth was quieter once more, but it was not the same silence as before the first visitors. This was a silence filled with memory. In different regions across the world, separated by land and sea, these survivors began to rebuild. Not cities, not yet, but communities. Small, fragile, uncertain. They turned again to the al-ard, to survival, to the rhythms of nature. But something lingered, a sense that they had once known more, a feeling that something had been lost, and above all, a memory of the sky. It was not a clear memory, not a detailed account, but an impression, a presence that had once been closer, more involved, now distant and unreachable. For a time, there were no signs of return. The visitors who had once guided, observed, and perhaps even shaped the course of human development did not appear. The skies remained still. The strange lights did not come. The silence stretched across generations. And yet, the knowledge that had been passed down, incomplete as it was, continued to influence the way these early communities saw the world. They did not look at the sky as empty. They looked at it as a place of origin, a place of power, a place from which something had once come and might one day return. It is during this period that the first true shift in human perception began to take form. Without direct contact, without the presence of the visitors to interpret or guide, humans began to assign meaning to what they remembered. And in doing so, they transformed it. The beings from the sky were no longer observers. They became something greater, something beyond question. They became gods. This transformation was not immediate, nor was it uniform. It happened gradually, shaped by the needs, fears, and hopes of each group. But the core idea remained consistent. There had been beings who came from above. They possessed knowledge beyond human understanding. They influenced the course of life on Earth, and they had left. From this foundation, the earliest forms of belief systems began to emerge. Not structured religions as we know them today, but frameworks of interpretation, ways of making sense of a past that could no longer be verified. Rituals began to form, not as empty gestures, but as attempts to reconnect. Fires lit in specific patterns, offerings placed at certain times, gatherings aligned with celestial events. These were not random acts. They were based on fragments of older knowledge, reshaped into something that felt meaningful in a world that no longer had direct answers. And in some places, these rituals went further. There are accounts, difficult to trace and even harder to confirm, of individuals who sought more than remembrance. They sought contact. They believed that if the visitors had once come, they could be called again, through repetition, through alignment, through precise actions carried out at the right time in the right place. At first, nothing happened. The sky remained silent. But persistence is a powerful force. Over time, in certain locations, something began to respond. Not in the same way as before, not with the open, visible presence of structures descending from the sky, but in subtler forms. Dreams, visions, moments of clarity that came without warning. Individuals who participated in these rituals began to report experiences that felt real, even if they left no physical trace. They described encounters not with fully formed beings, but with impressions, shapes of thought, presences that existed just beyond perception. Communication returned, but it was no longer direct. It was filtered, interpreted, and often misunderstood. These individuals, like those who had encountered the visitors in earlier times, began to change. They became central figures within their communities, not because they claimed authority, but because they carried something others did not. They became intermediaries, the first true bridge between humanity and what was now considered the divine. And it is here that the idea of a covenant began to take shape. Not a written agreement, not a formal declaration, but a shared understanding. Humans would remember. They would preserve what knowledge they could. They would build, align, observe, and honor the patterns that had once been shown to them. And in return, the beings from the sky would not abandon them entirely. They would guide in limited ways. They would provide fragments of knowledge when needed. They would remain present, even if unseen. This understanding, whether real or imagined, became deeply embedded in the early belief systems of multiple cultures. It shaped the way humans approached both the earth and the sky. But like all things passed through generations, it began to change. Details were added, meanings shifted. What may have once been a relationship based on observation and knowledge began to take on elements of control and hierarchy. The beings from the sky were no longer just teachers. They became rulers, judges, forces that demanded obedience, not just understanding. And yet, beneath these layers of interpretation, something more subtle remained. A pattern that had not been entirely lost. Certain groups continued to focus not on worship, but on alignment. They studied the movement of celestial bodies with a level of dedication that went beyond simple curiosity. They tracked cycles, recorded positions, and began to anticipate events with increasing accuracy. They were not just remembering, they were reconstructing. Piece by piece, they began to recover fragments of the original knowledge. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to create something new, a hybrid of memory and discovery. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for what would come next. Because the covenant, whether it had ever truly existed in a formal sense or not, had consequences. It created expectation. It created purpose. It created a belief that humanity was part of something larger, something that extended beyond the boundaries of the earth. And perhaps most importantly, it created a goal. To rebuild what had been lost, to reach again toward the sky, to create something that would not only honor the past, but reconnect with it. But there was a problem. The knowledge was incomplete, the understanding fragmented, and without direct guidance, mistakes were inevitable. Some groups began to interpret the fragments in ways that diverged from the original intent. Rituals became more elaborate, more symbolic, and in some cases, more extreme. The desire to reconnect turned into a need to prove worthiness. Offerings became sacrifices. Alignment became obsession. And the original purpose, whatever it had been, became increasingly difficult to discern. Still, not all paths led in that direction. In certain regions, a quieter approach persisted. Observation over worship. Understanding over fear. These groups would play a crucial role in what came next. Because as humanity continued to evolve, to organize, and to expand, the stage was being set for the rise of something new. A civilization that would inherit not just the fragments of the past, but the ambition to turn them into something permanent, something undeniable, something that would stand against time itself. But before that could happen, there would be another shift, another moment when the distance between humanity and the visitors would change once again. Because while humans debated, remembered, and reinterpreted, something else had been watching, waiting for the right moment to act. And when that moment came, it would not be as simple as guidance. It would bring with it conflict, division, and a truth that had been hidden even from those who believed they understood the covenant. Because not all who came from the sky shared the same purpose, and not all of them agreed on what humanity was meant to become. Long before the pyramids rose above the Pyramid of Egypt, before the first pharaohs claimed divine authority, something else had already begun to take shape across the earth. Not kingdoms, not empires, but structures. They did not appear all at once, nor were they concentrated in a single location. They emerged slowly, scattered across distant lands, separated by oceans and continents, yet bound by something that cannot be easily explained: a shared design, a shared intention. These were not the simple arrangements of stones that early humans had once used to mark time or track the stars. These were larger, more precise, more deliberate, and in many cases, they should not have been possible. Massive stones, some weighing more than anything a small community could realistically move, were cut and positioned with an accuracy that challenges even modern understanding. surfaces smoothed to a level that leaves little room for error, angles aligned with celestial events that occur only once in many years. These were not experiments. They were executed with confidence, as if the builders already knew exactly what they were doing. The question that follows is unavoidable. How? Traditional explanations offer possibilities: gradual development of tools, trial and error over generations, the natural evolution of human ingenuity. And yet, when examined closely, these explanations begin to show their limits. Because these structures do not reflect a slow progression. They appear suddenly, fully formed in concept, with a level of sophistication that suggests not the beginning of a process, but the continuation of one. It is as if the knowledge required to build them had existed before the builders themselves. Across the world, patterns begin to emerge. Certain sites are aligned with the rising and setting of the sun during solstices and equinoxes. Others correspond to the positions of specific stars or constellations at particular moments in time. Some even reflect astronomical configurations that would have occurred thousands of years earlier, long before the structures were built. This is not random. It is not decorative. It is intentional. And perhaps most intriguing of all, these alignments often extend beyond individual sites. When viewed on a larger scale, they form networks, lines that connect distant locations, relationships that suggest coordination across vast distances, a global pattern. But how could such coordination exist in a time before written language, before advanced navigation, before any known means of long-distance communication? There are those who suggest that it could not, that the only explanation lies beyond conventional understanding, that the knowledge guiding these constructions did not originate solely from human minds. This idea is often dismissed, not because it lacks intrigue, but because it challenges established frameworks. It introduces variables that are difficult to measure, difficult to prove, and even more difficult to accept. And yet, the structures remain silent, unyielding, resistant to explanation. In some locations, the stones themselves tell a story. They bear marks that do not align with primitive tools, cuts that are too clean, surfaces that show signs of techniques not easily replicated with simple instruments. In certain cases, the stones appear to have been shaped in ways that suggest an understanding of material properties far beyond what would be expected. It is not just the size or the placement, it is the method, and the method implies knowledge. There are also anomalies, structures that incorporate stones of such size and weight that even with modern equipment, moving them would be a significant challenge. Stones that are fitted together with such precision that no mortar is needed, and yet they remain stable after thousands of years. This is not just construction, it is mastery. And mastery does not appear without foundation. It must be learned, taught, passed down. But from whom? If we return to the fragments of earlier stories, to the accounts of visitors from the sky and the knowledge they may have shared, a different possibility begins to take shape. What if these structures are not simply human achievements? What if they are the result of a collaboration? Not necessarily direct, not necessarily constant, but guided, influenced. The idea of guidance does not require the presence of the builders themselves. It does not require visible interaction or direct control. It could take the form of knowledge transferred, concepts introduced, or methods demonstrated in ways that were later adapted by human hands. If this is the case, then these structures represent more than physical achievements. They represent a phase of learning, a stage in which humanity was beginning to apply something that had been given, something that originated from beyond its own experience. And yet, there is another layer to consider. Because not all of these structures serve an obvious purpose. Some appear to function as observatories, tracking the movement of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. Others seem to mark specific locations, acting as reference points within a larger network. But there are also those whose purpose remains unclear. They do not align perfectly with known astronomical events. They do not appear to serve practical needs such as shelter or defense. And yet, they are constructed with the same level of precision and effort. Why? One possibility is that their purpose is not purely physical, that they serve a function that is not immediately visible. There are theories, often categorized as speculative, that suggest these structures may have been designed to interact with forces not fully understood: energy fields, resonance patterns, frequencies that exist beyond the range of human perception. According to these theories, the placement, shape, and material of the structures are not arbitrary. They are components of a system that could influence the environment in subtle ways, stabilizing, amplifying, or perhaps even communicating. If such a system existed, it would require not only advanced knowledge, but precise execution. Small errors could disrupt the entire function. Variations in placement or alignment could alter the outcome. And yet, the consistency observed across multiple sites suggests that the builders were aware of these requirements. They followed a design, a blueprint. But where did that blueprint come from? It is here that the idea of the covenant, introduced in earlier traditions, takes on new meaning. If there had been an agreement, an understanding between humanity and the beings from the sky, then perhaps these structures were part of that agreement. Not as acts of worship, but as tasks, objectives that needed to be completed, steps in a larger process. This would explain the scale of effort involved, the coordination required, the persistence across generations. Because these structures were not built quickly, they required time, planning, commitment, and above all, belief. A belief that what they were building mattered, even if the full purpose was not understood. As these structures continued to appear, something else began to change. Human societies became more organized, more hierarchical. Leadership roles became more defined, not solely based on strength or survival skills, but on knowledge. Those who understood the patterns, who could interpret the alignments, who claimed to possess insight into the purpose of these constructions, began to hold influence. Power shifted. Not completely, not everywhere, but enough to alter the trajectory of development. This was no longer just survival. This was direction, a movement toward something specific. And yet, beneath this progress, there were signs of tension. Not all groups agreed on the methods. Not all interpretations of the knowledge were the same. Some viewed the structures as sacred, to be approached with caution and reverence. Others saw them as tools, to be used, expanded, and possibly controlled. These differences did not immediately lead to conflict, but they created divisions, paths that would eventually diverge. Because if the knowledge guiding these constructions did not originate from a single source, then it is possible that not all guidance was aligned. Not all intentions were the same. This raises a troubling possibility. What if the visitors, those who had once been seen as a unified presence, were not unified at all? What if there were different groups, different perspectives, even different objectives? If so, then the structures being built across the Earth may not all serve the same purpose. Some may align with one vision, others with another, and humanity, still in the early stages of understanding, would have no way of distinguishing between them. They would build, they would follow, they would believe, without fully knowing whose design they were bringing into reality. As this era progressed, the scale of construction began to increase. The structures grew larger, more complex, more ambitious. And slowly, in one particular region, along the banks of a river that would later become one of the most important in history, the foundations were being laid for something unprecedented. Something that would surpass all that had come before. something that would embody the culmination of knowledge, belief, and intention: the pyramids. But before they could rise, before their purpose could be realized, the divisions that had begun to form would have to surface. Because not all who guided humanity agreed on what those pyramids were meant to be. And when that disagreement finally revealed itself, it would not remain hidden in symbols or structures. It would emerge as conflict. A conflict not just between humans, but between those who had come from the sky. By the time the great structures began to rise across the earth, humanity believed it was following a single path, a path shaped by memory, guided by fragments of knowledge, sanctioned perhaps by the same beings who had once descended from the sky. But that belief was incomplete, because far above the surface of the earth, beyond the reach of human perception, something else was unfolding. Something that would never be recorded in stone, something that would leave no clear trace in the archaeological record. A conflict. Not sudden, not chaotic, but controlled, calculated. A conflict that did not announce itself with fire or destruction visible to all, but one that operated within boundaries, hidden behind the limits of human awareness. The visitors were not one. They never had been. From the earliest encounters, there had been subtle differences, variations in form, differences in behavior, in the way knowledge was given, and in what knowledge was withheld. At first, these differences had gone unnoticed. To early humans, all who came from the sky were the same, but as the interactions became more focused, more deliberate, the divisions among the visitors began to matter. There were those who observed, those who guided, and those who interfered. Their purposes were not aligned. Some appeared to favor a gradual development of humanity, a careful introduction of knowledge, limited interaction, a long-term progression that allowed humans to evolve without becoming dependent. Others did not share this restraint. They saw potential, opportunity, not just in the growth of humanity, but in the structures being built, the alignments being established, the networks forming across the planet. To them, Earth was not just a place to observe, it was a system, and systems can be used. As the scale of construction increased, so did the importance of control. Because the structures were no longer isolated, they were becoming connected, aligned not only with the stars, but with each other. Points in a network that, if fully realized, could function as something far greater than the sum of its parts. A system capable of interacting with forces that humans could not yet perceive, and perhaps not meant to. If such a system were completed under a unified purpose, it could serve as a bridge, a connection between Earth and something beyond. But if divided, if influenced by competing intentions, it could become unstable, unpredictable, dangerous. This is where the conflict began. Not on the ground, but above it. Not visible, but present. There are no direct records of this war, no written accounts that describe it in clear terms. But there are traces, inconsistencies in the patterns, shifts in the way structures were designed, changes in alignment that suggest interference, sites that appear to have been abandoned mid-construction, as if the original plan had been disrupted. And perhaps most telling of all, sudden changes in the traditions of the people who built them. In some regions, knowledge that had been carefully preserved began to fracture. Interpretations diverged more sharply. Disagreements emerged not just about how to build, but why. These were not simple differences of opinion. They reflected something deeper, a change in influence. It is possible that different groups of humans were being guided by different visitors, given different instructions, different interpretations of the same fragments of knowledge. If this is true, then humanity was no longer following a single path. It was being pulled in multiple directions, and the builders themselves may not have realized it. To them, each path felt correct, Each instruction carried the weight of something beyond their understanding. Each vision seemed aligned with the memory of those who had once come from the sky. But they could not all be right. As this division deepened, the conflict among the visitors intensified, not in a way that humans could easily observe, but in subtle disruptions. Moments when the sky behaved strangely. Periods when the patterns of celestial movement seemed to shift, even if only slightly. Unexplained phenomena that affected not just isolated regions, but multiple sites at once. There are accounts, rare and often dismissed, that speak of lights in the sky not moving with the calm precision of earlier encounters, but with urgency, with intent, as if responding to something, or pursuing something. These were not the silent, controlled descents that had once been observed. These were movements of tension, of opposition. And though the conflict remained largely hidden, its effects began to reach the surface. In certain locations, structures that had been stable for generations showed signs of disruption. Alignments that had once been precise no longer matched the expected patterns. Observations that had been reliable began to produce inconsistent results. For those who depended on this knowledge, this was more than a technical problem. It was a crisis. Because if the patterns could not be trusted, then the foundation of everything they were building was in question. And without understanding the cause, they could not correct it. Some attempted to adapt, to adjust the structures, to realign them based on new observations. Others refused, believing that the original designs were correct and that any deviation was a mistake. This created further division, further instability. And beneath it all, the unseen conflict continued. There is another possibility, one that is rarely considered. That the conflict was not just about control of the structures, but about their purpose. Because if the network being built across the Earth had the potential to function as a gateway, then the question becomes critical. A gateway for what? For communication? For travel? For influence? Different visitors may have had different answers. Some may have seen the network as a means of connection, a way to maintain a link between Earth and a broader system, while allowing humanity to develop independently. Others may have seen it as an opportunity to establish presence, to anchor themselves, to gain access to something unique about this planet. If these intentions conflicted, then the outcome of the structures being built would matter greatly. And humanity, unknowingly, stood at the center of that outcome. As the conflict progressed, there are indications that certain sites were deliberately altered, not destroyed, but modified, subtly, in ways that would change their function without making the change obvious. This would require precision, knowledge of the original design, and access, which suggests that the interference was not external. It came from within the same system that had guided the construction in the first place. Trust, once assumed, could no longer be certain. And yet the builders continued, because they had no choice. The momentum had already begun. The belief in the importance of what they were creating was too strong to abandon. And perhaps, in some cases, the influence guiding them was too powerful to resist. As this hidden war moved toward its peak, the balance began to shift. Not evenly, not clearly, but enough to alter the direction of what would come next. Certain regions gained prominence. Certain designs became dominant. And gradually, the scattered efforts across the Earth began to converge toward a single, monumental expression. A structure that would embody the culmination of everything that had been learned, given, and contested. A structure that would define an era, but also one that would carry within it the unresolved tensions of the conflict that shaped it. The pyramids. They would not be built in a time of peace. They would not be the result of a single vision. They would be the outcome of compromise, of influence, of hidden struggle. And as their foundations began to take form, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. Whatever had been guiding humanity from the sky was no longer unified. And whatever the pyramids were meant to become, their purpose would depend on which side of the conflict had the final influence. Before the pyramids were ever imagined, before the Nile became the heart of a civilization known to history, the world experienced a moment that changed everything. A turning point. A collapse so vast that most of its evidence was swallowed by time. The forgotten civilization, the one that had once stood closer to the knowledge of the sky than any other, did not simply fade away. It ended abruptly. Its systems fractured, its networks dissolved, its people scattered across a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar and unstable. And at the center of this collapse was something that had been building for a long time. Pressure. Not just environmental pressure, though the Earth itself was changing during that era. Glaciers were shifting, sea levels were rising in unpredictable stages. Regions that had once been stable began to experience floods, earthquakes, and violent storms that reshaped entire landscapes. But this was only part of the story, because while the Earth was transforming, the conflict above it had not yet resolved. The hidden war between the visitors continued to influence the fragile balance that had been guiding humanity's development. And as the network of structures expanded, as the alignments became more complex, the system itself grew more sensitive, more unstable. If the structures truly formed a kind of interconnected system, then even small disruptions could create large consequences. A change in one location might ripple outward across the entire network. And that appears to be exactly what happened. There are traces, subtle but persistent, suggesting that several key sites experienced sudden, unexplained damage around the same period of time. Not gradual decay, but events that displaced massive stones, shattered alignments, and buried entire areas beneath layers of sediment. Some researchers attribute this to natural disasters, and it is true that the Earth during this time was far from calm. But the timing raises questions. Multiple regions affected within relatively narrow windows of time, evidence of intense forces acting in ways that do not always match known patterns of earthquakes or floods. Something amplified the destruction, something that turned environmental change into catastrophe. If the network being built across the Earth had reached a critical stage, then interference during that stage could have triggered consequences no one fully understood, not the humans who built the structures, and perhaps not even the visitors who influenced them. There is a possibility that the system had begun to activate, not fully, not in the way it may have been intended, but enough to alter the balance of forces around it. Energy, once theoretical and unobserved by human senses, may have begun to move through the network. Subtle at first, then increasingly unstable as the conflict between the guiding influences intensified. If one group of visitors sought to stabilize the system, while another attempted to redirect it, the result could have been catastrophic. An overload, a disruption that the structures themselves could not contain. The consequences would not have been limited to a single location. They would have spread through the alignments, through the connections, across the world. And when the collapse began, it did not look like a war. It looked like nature turning against humanity. The sky darkened in ways that frightened those who witnessed it. Storms appeared where there had once been calm seasons. Rivers changed course. Lands that had supported life for generations were suddenly submerged or torn apart. In coastal regions, waves arrived with unimaginable force, reaching far beyond their usual boundaries. Entire settlements vanished beneath water that did not retreat. In other places, the ground itself shifted. Massive stones that had been carefully positioned for alignment were thrown out of place. Foundations cracked. Sites that had taken generations to build were rendered useless in a matter of moments. And through all of this, the visitors who had once been present were nowhere to be seen. No guidance, no intervention, only the silence of a sky that no longer responded. For the people who lived through this time, the experience would have been beyond comprehension. Their understanding of the world had been built on patterns that now seemed broken. The knowledge passed down from earlier generations no longer provided answers. And yet, even in the midst of collapse, some remembered fragments of the older teachings. They understood, at least in part, that the structures were connected, that the alignments mattered, that something larger than a simple natural disaster was unfolding. These individuals attempted to act. There are signs that certain groups tried to protect or preserve key sites, reinforcements added to structures, attempts made to restore damaged alignments, efforts to move important stones before they were lost. The time was not on their side. The scale of the catastrophe was too great. The system, whatever it had once been intended to become, was breaking apart faster than it could be repaired. And then came the final phase, the one that would be remembered across cultures as a great flood, a great fire, or a great darkness, depending on where it was witnessed. In some regions, the seas rose dramatically over a relatively short period of time. Land bridges that had once connected distant areas disappeared beneath water. Coastal plains that had supported communities for thousands of years became ocean floor. In other areas, the sky remained filled with ash and dust, dimming the sunlight and altering the climate. Crops failed. Migration became necessary for survival. And as the environment shifted, the networks of knowledge that had once connected distant groups began to collapse. Communication ended. Coordination vanished. Each group was left to survive on its own. The great civilization that had once carried the closest connection to the visitors from the sky was gone. Not entirely erased, but broken into fragments too small to maintain what had once existed. Yet even in this moment of loss, something important survived. Memory. Not perfect memory, not detailed records, but echoes. Stories that would later become myths of destruction and rebirth. Tales of gods who once walked among humans and then disappeared during a time of chaos. Warnings about cycles of the earth and sky that could bring sudden change. These stories would be passed down by the descendants of the survivors, and those descendants would eventually become the ancestors of the civilizations we recognize today. Among them, some carried more knowledge than others, not enough to rebuild what had been lost immediately, but enough to preserve certain principles. Alignment with the sky, respect for the patterns of the cosmos, the belief that humanity had once been guided by forces beyond the earth. And perhaps most importantly, the idea that what had been lost could be rebuilt. But the survivors did not know everything. They did not know the full nature of the conflict that had influenced their world. They did not know which visitors had tried to preserve the system and which had contributed to its collapse. They did not know whether the sky would ever respond again. All they knew was that the old world was gone, and the new world would have to begin in uncertainty. Small groups moved across continents, carrying tools, stories, and fragments of knowledge that would shape the future in ways they could not yet imagine. Some settled near rivers that offered stability and resources. Some moved inland to avoid the rising seas. Others followed ancient routes that had once connected the great sites of the lost civilization, hoping to find remnants that could still be used. Among these new settlements, one region began to show unusual promise. A river that flowed predictably, land that renewed itself with seasonal floods rather than destructive waves. A place where stability might allow knowledge to grow again. That river would one day be called the Nile. But the survivors who arrived there did not yet know the role it would play in the future. They only knew that the sky, though silent, still held answers. And somewhere beyond it, the visitors who had once shaped the fate of the ancient world were still out there, watching the aftermath, waiting to see what humanity would become after the fall. After the fall of the ancient world, humanity did not rise together. It rose in fragments. Across continents reshaped by water, fire, and shifting al-ard, small groups of survivors began again. They built simple shelters, relearned patterns of survival, and slowly adapted to a world that no longer resembled the one their ancestors had known. But among these scattered groups, not all carried the same inheritance. Some had only instinct and memory of disaster. Others carried something more. Fragments of knowledge. Not complete, not fully understood, but preserved with care. Passed from one generation to the next, not as stories meant to entertain, but as truths that could not be allowed to disappear. These individuals did not see themselves as rulers. They did not claim power in the way later kings would. Instead, they took on a different role. They became guardians. Keepers of something fragile, something that could be lost forever if not protected. In different regions, under different names, these individuals emerged independently, yet their roles were strikingly similar. They observed the sky. They tracked cycles. They remembered patterns that others no longer recognized. They became the first carriers of memory. Their knowledge was not written. Writing, as we understand it, had not yet been fully developed. Instead, they relied on repetition, oral transmission, ritualized teaching designed not just to pass information, but to preserve its structure. Every word mattered. Every sequence had to remain intact, because if even small details were lost, the meaning could change. Over time, these carriers formed networks of their own, not through direct communication across great distances, but through parallel development. Groups that had never met began to follow similar practices. They marked the passage of time using the stars. They aligned simple structures with celestial events. They preserved symbols that, though altered, still reflected older patterns. It was as if the fragments of the lost civilization were reassembling themselves, slowly, imperfectly, but with a clear direction. Among these carriers, there were those who held deeper fragments than others. They possessed knowledge that went beyond simple observation. They understood that the alignments were not just markers of time, but part of something larger, a system that had once connected multiple sites across the Earth, a system that had failed. But not beyond recovery. These individuals became more than guardians. They became guides. Not leaders in the traditional sense, but sources of direction. Their communities looked to them not just for understanding, but for decisions. When to plant, when to move, when to gather, when to observe. Their influence grew not through force, but through reliability, because their knowledge worked. Even in a world that had changed, the patterns of the sky remained consistent. The stars still moved in predictable ways. The cycles still repeated, even if the aura beneath them had shifted. This gave the carriers a form of authority that could not easily be challenged. And yet, they remained cautious. Because within their inherited knowledge, there were warnings. Not always clear, not always fully understood, but present. Warnings about cycles of destruction, about the dangers of imbalance, about the consequences of misunderstanding the forces they were attempting to engage with. These warnings were not ignored, but they were not always interpreted correctly. As generations passed, the original context of the knowledge continued to fade. The carriers preserved what they could, but without the full system that had once supported it, gaps began to form. To fill those gaps, interpretation was necessary, and interpretation introduces variation. Some carriers chose to protect the knowledge by limiting it. They shared only what was necessary for survival and basic alignment. The deeper fragments, the more complex patterns, were kept within small groups, hidden, preserved in secrecy. Others took a different approach. They believed that knowledge should be expanded, not restricted, that the only way to rebuild what had been lost was to explore, experiment, and apply the fragments in new ways. This created a subtle divide, not open conflict, not yet, but a difference in philosophy. Preservation versus reconstruction. Secrecy versus expansion. Both sides believed they were protecting the future. Both may have been correct. As these approaches developed, certain regions began to stand out, areas where the conditions allowed for stability, where the al-ard provided consistent resources, where the sky could be observed clearly without obstruction. These regions became centers of development, places where knowledge could grow beyond survival and begin to shape culture. Among them, one region in particular began to attract attention. Not from across the world, not in any organized sense, but through movement. Small groups migrating, settling, recognizing something familiar in the landscape. A river that flooded with rhythm, not chaos. A cycle that could be predicted, measured, and relied upon. This river offered something that had become rare after the fall: consistency. And with consistency came opportunity. The carriers who settled along its banks began to experiment more freely. They marked the flood cycles. They aligned their observations with the stars. They tested the fragments of knowledge they had preserved against a stable environment. And for the first time since the collapse, something began to resemble progress. Not rapid, not dramatic, but steady. Structures became more deliberate, not massive yet, but carefully placed, aligned with intention. Communities grew larger, more organized, and within them, the role of the carriers evolved. They were no longer just guardians. They became architects of knowledge, designers of systems that integrated survival, observation, and meaning. They began to formalize what had once been fluid, to create frameworks that could be taught more efficiently, to ensure that the fragments they carried would not be lost again. But as this process continued, something unexpected began to happen. The knowledge itself began to exert influence, not in a mystical sense, but through its implications. Because as the carriers reconstructed more of the original patterns, they began to realize that the structures of the past had not been isolated achievements. They had been part of something much larger, a network that had once spanned the Earth. And if that network had existed once, then, in theory, it could exist again. This realization changed everything. Because rebuilding such a system would require more than small communities and simple alignments. It would require coordination on a scale that had not been attempted since before the fall. It would require leadership, organization, resources, and above all, belief. A belief strong enough to justify the effort, strong enough to unite people under a shared purpose. This is where the seeds of civilization began to take root, not just in the physical sense, but in the conceptual one. The idea that humanity could build something lasting, something meaningful, something that connected the al-ard to the sky. And as this idea spread, the role of the carriers became even more significant, because they held the key, not just to the past, but to the future. They were the ones who understood, even if imperfectly, what had once been attempted, what had failed, and what might be possible again. But they were not alone in recognizing this, because as the carriers began to rebuild, as the structures began to take form, as the patterns of the past started to re-emerge, something else began to take notice, something that had been silent since the fall, watching, waiting. The visitors. They had not intervened during the collapse. They had not prevented the destruction, but they had not disappeared. And now, as humanity moved once again toward the knowledge it had nearly lost, the distance between earth and sky began to shift. Not suddenly, not visibly, but enough to be felt. Subtle changes in the way the sky was perceived, moments of clarity that seemed to come from beyond, the faint return of something that had once been more direct. The carriers noticed. They did not speak of it openly, but they understood what it might mean. The covenant, whether real or imagined, was not entirely broken. The connection, though weakened, still existed, and as humanity prepared to take its next step, to move from scattered survival to organized creation, one question began to rise once more. If the visitors were watching again, would they guide what came next? Or would they once again divide what humanity was trying to become? Along the banks of the great river, something began to change. Not suddenly, not in a way that could be marked by a single moment, but gradually, with a quiet certainty that distinguished it from all that had come before. The Nile did not behave like the waters that had destroyed the ancient world. It did not rise in chaos. It did not erase without warning. It moved with rhythm, with purpose. Each year, its waters would swell, spilling across the land, depositing fertile layers of silt that transformed barren ground into something capable of sustaining life. And each year, just as predictably, it would retreat, leaving behind a landscape renewed. To the survivors who had known only instability, this was more than a resource. It was a pattern, a reliable cycle in a world that had once lost all sense of order. The carriers of memory, those who had preserved fragments of ancient knowledge, recognized its significance immediately. This was not just a place to survive. It was a place to rebuild. Communities along the Nile began to grow. At first, they were small, scattered, independent, groups bound by shared necessity rather than shared purpose. But as seasons passed and the river continued its steady rhythm, something began to unify them. Observation. The carriers studied the river as they had once studied the sky. They tracked its cycles, measured its rise and fall, noted the subtle variations that could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity. And as they observed, they began to see connections. The flooding of the Nile was not random. It aligned, in subtle ways, with patterns in the sky. The position of certain stars at dawn, the movement of constellations across the horizon, the timing of celestial events that, at first glance, seemed unrelated to the behavior of water. But they were not unrelated. They were connected. This realization marked a turning point, because it meant that the earth and the sky were not separate systems. They were part of the same structure, a structure that could be understood, predicted, and perhaps, one day, influenced. As this understanding grew, the role of the carriers expanded once again. They were no longer just keepers of memory or guides of survival. They became interpreters of reality, bridges between the visible and the invisible patterns that governed the world. Their knowledge began to shape the way communities organized themselves. Agriculture became more efficient, aligned with the cycles they tracked. Settlements were positioned with greater intention, taking into account not just immediate needs, but long-term stability. And slowly, almost without realizing it, these communities began to transform into something new, a civilization. Not yet in its full form, not yet with the complexity and scale it would later achieve, but unmistakably different from the scattered groups that had emerged after the fall. There was structure, hierarchy, purpose, and at the center of it all, there was knowledge. Knowledge that carried echoes of a time before the ancient world collapsed. But something else was happening as well, something more subtle. As the patterns of the sky were studied with increasing precision, certain stars began to take on greater significance than others. Not because they were brighter, but because of what they represented. Their positions aligned with key moments in the cycle of the Nile, Their movements corresponded to changes in the environment. And among these stars, one in particular stood out. It appeared just before the flooding began. A signal, a marker, a guide. For those who observed closely, this star became more than a point of light. It became a message, a reminder that the sky still held answers, that the connection between Earth and something beyond it had not been entirely lost. The carriers understood this, or at least they believed they did. And from this belief, a new idea began to take shape. If the patterns of the sky could guide the behavior of the Earth, then perhaps structures built in alignment with those patterns could do more than mark time. They could interact. Not in a way that was fully understood, but in a way that was consistent with the fragments of knowledge passed down from the lost civilization. This idea was not entirely new. It had existed before, in different forms. But now, for the first time since the fall, there was a stable environment in which it could be explored. And so, the building began again. At first, the structures were modest, carefully placed stones, simple alignments, markers that corresponded to the rising and setting of important stars. But as confidence grew, so did ambition. The carriers began to experiment, to test the limits of their understanding, to recreate, piece by piece, the principles that had once guided the construction of the ancient network. They did not have all the knowledge. They did not fully understand the original purpose, but they had enough to begin. And as they built, something remarkable happened. The structures began to align not just with the sky, but with each other. Across the Nile region, different sites started to form a pattern, a network. Not yet as vast as the one that had existed before the collapse, but unmistakably similar in concept. This was no longer accidental. It was intentional, a deliberate attempt to reconstruct something that had been lost. And as this network began to take shape, the social structure of the communities changed with it. Leadership became more centralized, not purely through force, but through control of knowledge. Those who understood the alignments, who could predict the flooding, who could interpret the movements of the stars, held influence. Their decisions affected not just individual groups, but entire regions. And with influence came authority. The earliest forms of what would later become kingship began to emerge, not as absolute power, not yet, but as a recognized role, a position that combined leadership with knowledge, guidance with responsibility. But this development came with consequences, because as power concentrated, so did interpretation. The knowledge that had once been shared among carriers began to be controlled, filtered, in some cases, altered. Not always intentionally, sometimes as a result of misunderstanding, sometimes as a means of maintaining authority. And as this happened, the original purpose of the knowledge became harder to trace. What had once been a system of observation and alignment began to take on elements of belief. The stars were no longer just markers. They became symbols. The patterns were no longer just cycles. They became narratives, stories of forces beyond the Earth that influenced life below. And slowly, the line between knowledge and mythology began to blur. But even within this transformation, there were those who remained focused on the original intent. They continued to study, to observe, to refine the alignments. They understood that what they were building was not complete, not yet. There was something missing, something that had existed in the ancient network but had not yet been fully recovered. Scale. The structures, though precise, were not large enough, not powerful enough. If the network was to function as it once had, it would require something greater, something that could anchor the system, something that could serve as a central point of alignment, a structure unlike anything that had been built since the fall. This idea began to spread among those who held the deepest fragments of knowledge. It was not yet a plan, not yet a design, but it was a direction, a vision of something that would rise above all other constructions, something that would embody the connection between earth and sky. And as this vision took hold, something else began to return. Not fully, not openly, but enough to be noticed. Moments of clarity, insights that seemed to come from beyond ordinary understanding, solutions to problems that had no obvious origin. The carriers felt it, a presence, faint, distant, but real. The visitors, they were watching again. Perhaps they had never stopped. But now, as humanity moved closer to rebuilding what had once been lost, their influence began to surface once more. Subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. And with that influence came a question that would shape everything that followed. Was humanity being guided toward something it had once nearly achieved? Or was it being led toward a path that would repeat the mistakes of the past? By the time the idea first took form, it did not appear as a monument. It did not begin as a symbol of power, nor as a resting place for the dead. It began as a solution, a response to a problem that only a few fully understood. Along the Nile, knowledge had grown stronger. The carriers of memory had rebuilt much of what had been lost after the fall. They could track the stars with precision. They could predict the flooding of the river. They had begun to reconnect fragments of a system that once spanned the earth. But something was still missing. The network they were rebuilding lacked a center, a point of stability, a structure that could anchor the alignments and unify the patterns they were beginning to observe. Without it, everything remained incomplete. The smaller structures worked, but only in isolation. Their effects, whatever those effects may have been, did not extend far enough. They did not connect in the way the ancient system once had. There needed to be something greater, something capable of holding the entire framework together. This idea did not come from a single mind. It emerged gradually, through observation, discussion, and perhaps something more subtle: influence. The carriers who studied the deeper patterns began to converge on a concept, a structure that would not simply align with the stars, but replicate their relationships in physical form. A structure that would act as a point of resonance, a place where the patterns of the sky could be focused, stabilized, and possibly amplified. But to achieve this, the design would have to be precise, more precise than anything built before. Every angle, every measurement, every orientation. All of it would need to reflect a deeper understanding of the relationship between earth and sky. And so, the earliest designs began to take shape, not drawn on paper, but formed in thought, passed through discussion, refined through generations of observation. The structure would rise upward, not in steps, but in a continuous form, a shape that would direct focus, a shape that would connect ground to sky in the most efficient way possible. A pyramid. But not the pyramid that would later be understood, not a tomb, not a monument to a king. At its origin, the pyramid was something else entirely. A device. Not mechanical in the way modern machines are understood, but functional in a way that served a purpose beyond appearance. Its base would be aligned with the cardinal directions, not approximately, exactly. Its sides would rise at specific angles, chosen not for stability alone, but for their relationship to mathematical principles that governed proportions found both in nature and in the movement of celestial bodies. Its internal chambers would not be random. They would be positioned with intention, placed at points where forces, whether physical or otherwise, could be concentrated or directed. The materials used would matter. Stone, chosen not just for durability, but for its properties: density, composition, response to environmental factors. All of these elements would contribute to the function of the structure. But what was that function? There are many theories. Some suggest that the pyramid was designed as a source of energy, Not energy in the conventional sense, but something more subtle. A form of resonance created by the interaction between the structure, the earth beneath it, and the sky above it. Others propose that it was a communication device, a way to send or receive signals across distances far greater than the human voice could travel. Not through sound, but through patterns, through alignment, through frequencies that operated beyond normal perception. There are even those who believe it was intended as a gateway, not a physical doorway, but a point of transition, a place where the boundaries between different states of existence could be influenced. These ideas remain speculative, but within the context of the knowledge being reconstructed along the Nile, they are not entirely without foundation. Because the pyramid was not conceived in isolation, it was the culmination of everything that had come before, the fragments of the lost civilization, the alignments rebuilt by the carriers, the patterns observed in the movement of the stars, and perhaps the subtle guidance of the visitors who had once shaped humanity's path. As the design became clearer, the scale of the project revealed itself. This would not be a structure built by a small group. It would require thousands. Coordination on a level that had not been attempted since before the fall. Resources gathered over years. Planning that extended beyond a single lifetime. This was not just construction. This was commitment. And to achieve it, a new form of organization was required. The emerging civilization along the Nile began to shift once again. Leadership became more defined, centralized, not only around knowledge, but around authority. The individuals who could interpret the designs, who claimed to understand the purpose of the pyramid, began to hold positions of power. Their decisions guided the direction of the entire society. And with that power came a transformation. The knowledge that had once been shared among carriers became increasingly restricted, reserved for those at the top of the hierarchy, protected, in some cases, hidden. The pyramid was not just a project, it became a symbol, a representation of something greater than the people building it, something that connected them to the sky, to the past, and to whatever forces had once guided humanity. As construction began, the process itself revealed new challenges. The precision required was extraordinary. Small errors could disrupt the entire structure. And yet, the builders managed to achieve levels of accuracy that remain difficult to explain. This suggests that the knowledge guiding them was not entirely theoretical. It was practical, tested, refined, perhaps inherited from a time when such construction had been more common, or perhaps influenced, even now, by something beyond human understanding. There are accounts, difficult to verify but persistent in certain traditions, that speak of moments during construction when solutions appeared unexpectedly. Problems that seemed impossible were resolved with sudden clarity. Techniques that had not been used before were applied with confidence, as if the builders were not entirely alone in their efforts. This does not imply direct intervention. No clear evidence suggests that the visitors physically participated in the construction, but influence does not require presence. Guidance can take many forms. And if the visitors were still observing, still interested in the outcome, then it is possible that they played a role in shaping the process, subtly, indirectly. As the structure rose, stone by stone, something else began to change: the perception of its purpose. Among the general population, the pyramid was not understood as a device or a system. It was seen as something sacred, a connection to the divine, a place where the boundary between human and God could be approached. This belief was not entirely separate from the original intent, but it simplified it, transformed it into something more accessible, more manageable, and perhaps easier to control. Because as the pyramid grew, so did the influence of those who oversaw its construction. They began to shape not only the physical structure, but the narrative surrounding it. The idea that it was built for a ruler, for a king who would ascend to the sky. This idea may not have been part of the original design, but it served a purpose. It unified the people, gave them a reason to contribute, a story that made sense within their understanding. And so, the pyramid became two things at once. To those who held the deeper knowledge, it remained a system, a device, a critical component in a larger network. To the rest, it became a symbol, a monument to power, to belief, to the connection between earth and sky. Both perspectives coexisted, neither fully capturing the whole truth. And as the structure neared completion, one question began to emerge among those who understood its deeper purpose. If the pyramid truly functioned as intended, what would happen when it was activated? Because if the ancient network had once failed, contributing to the collapse of a civilization, then rebuilding it carried a risk that could not be fully measured. And as the final stones were placed, as the alignments were set, as the structure stood complete against the sky, something began to stir. Not in a way that could be seen, not in a way that could be easily explained, but enough to be felt. The system was ready. The pyramid stood as a signal, a focal point, a question sent into the silence above. And somewhere beyond that silence, something was listening, waiting to respond. When the pyramid was completed, the world did not change overnight. There was no sudden light descending from the heavens, no immediate sign that the structure had fulfilled its purpose. The desert remained silent. The Nile continued its rhythm. Life carried on as it always had. But beneath that silence, something had shifted. Not in the physical world alone, but in the relationship between earth and sky. The pyramid stood not merely as a structure, but as a signal, a point of alignment so precise, so intentional, that it altered the balance of something unseen. The network that had once existed before the fall, fragmented and lost, had now regained a center. And with that center restored, the system began to respond. At first, the changes were subtle. Those who were most attuned to the patterns, the remaining carriers of deeper knowledge, began to notice irregularities. Not disruptions, but enhancements. The stars seemed sharper, their movements easier to track. Alignments that had once required effort now revealed themselves with clarity. Time itself felt more predictable. Cycles became more precise. It was as if the world had come into focus. But this clarity came with something else. Presence. A sensation that had not been felt since before the collapse of the ancient world. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from imagination, but gradually becoming undeniable. The feeling of being observed, not in a threatening way, but in a deliberate one. Intentional. Focused. The carriers understood what this might mean. The pyramid had not simply aligned with the sky, it had reached it, and something had answered. The first signs were not visual. They came in dreams, visions experienced by those closest to the knowledge, images that did not belong to their own memories, patterns of stars arranged in ways they had never studied, yet somehow understood, structures that did not exist on Earth, yet felt familiar. These were not random, they were consistent. Across different individuals, in different locations, similar impressions began to emerge. Messages. Not spoken, not written, but conveyed through thought. Concepts placed into the mind, fragments of understanding that seemed to come from beyond. This was not the same as the encounters of the distant past. It was more controlled, more selective, as if whatever was responding to the pyramid was choosing its points of contact carefully. And then, gradually, the signs became physical. Lights appeared in the sky once more, not as frequent as in the earliest ages, not as openly visible, but unmistakable. Movements that defied natural patterns. Objects that hovered where nothing should remain still. They did not descend immediately. They observed. They waited. And as they did, the people below began to react. For most, these events were interpreted through the framework that had been built over generations. The gods had returned. The beings who had once walked among humanity, who had given knowledge and then disappeared during the Great Collapse, were now present again. This belief spread quickly, not because it was enforced, but because it made sense. It fit the patterns, it aligned with the stories, and it provided an explanation for what was happening in the sky. The rulers, those who oversaw the pyramid and held the knowledge of its construction, recognized the importance of this moment. But they also understood its danger, because if the return of the visitors was real, then their influence could reshape everything. Not just belief, but power. The pyramid had been built as a system, a device, a means of connection. But now, that connection was active. And with it came uncertainty. Because the visitors who responded were not necessarily the same as those who had once guided humanity. Or, if they were, they might not share the same intentions. The hidden conflict that had once influenced the ancient world had never been fully resolved. It had only been paused. And now, with the network partially restored, the conditions for that conflict could return. The first direct encounters of this new era were limited, small, controlled. Individuals selected not at random, but based on their position within the system. Those who held knowledge, those who were responsible for maintaining the alignments. They reported experiences similar to those described in the earliest stories. Beings that did not fully exist within the same space. Forms that shifted. Presences that communicated without sound. But there were differences. These beings were more distant, more reserved. Their interactions were brief, focused. They did not offer guidance freely. They did not share knowledge openly. Instead, they observed, evaluated, and when they did communicate, it was with purpose. Questions, not answers. Responses, not instructions. As if they were assessing something, testing the outcome of what had been built. This behavior raised concerns among the carriers who understood the deeper implications, because it suggested that the pyramid was not just a signal, it was a test, a demonstration of what humanity had become, what it had learned, what it was capable of reconstructing without direct guidance. And depending on that outcome, the response could vary. Not all visitors returned in the same way. There are indications that different types of encounters began to occur, some more direct, some more distant, some associated with clarity and understanding, others with confusion and contradiction. This mirrored the divisions that had once existed among the visitors, the same divisions that may have contributed to the collapse of the ancient world. If those divisions were returning, then the consequences could be significant. Because humanity was no longer in the same position it had been before. It had rebuilt. It had created structures that interacted with the sky. It had regained access to a system that extended beyond the Earth. And now, it was no longer simply being observed. It was participating. Whether it understood that participation or not. As the presence in the sky became more frequent, the society along the Nile continued to evolve. The rulers embraced the idea of divine connection. They positioned themselves not just as leaders, but as intermediaries, figures who could communicate with the gods, who could interpret their will. This strengthened their authority, unified the population, and ensured that the knowledge surrounding the pyramid remained under control. But beneath this structure of power, the original carriers remained cautious. They saw the changes. They recognized the patterns, and they remembered the warnings. Because the return of the visitors was not inherently positive. It was not inherently negative. It was a variable, one that had influenced the past in ways that were not fully understood. And now, it was influencing the present once again. The pyramid stood at the center of this interaction, silent, unmoving, yet deeply connected to everything that was unfolding. It had fulfilled its purpose. It had re-established the link. But what that link would bring remained uncertain. As the nights grew more active, as the sky revealed more signs of movement, one question began to take shape among those who understood the deeper layers of the system. Had humanity succeeded in reconnecting with the sky? Or had it reopened something that was never meant to return? From the outside, the pyramid appeared complete, a structure of perfect form, rising from the desert with a precision that seemed to defy time itself. Its surfaces, once smooth and reflective, caught the light of the sun and cast it back across the land. To those who stood before it, it was more than a creation of stone. It was a statement, a declaration that something had been achieved. But the true nature of the pyramid was never meant to be understood from the outside. Its purpose lay within. Deep inside its carefully measured geometry, beyond the visible entrances and known chambers, there existed a system that only a few were ever meant to approach. Not because it was hidden by accident, but because it required understanding to even recognize that it was there. The outer structure was only a shell, a protective layer, a precise framework designed to support something far more complex. Within the pyramid, the layout followed no simple logic. It was not designed for comfort, nor for display. The passages were narrow, the angles deliberate, the spaces arranged in ways that did not align with traditional human use. This was not architecture meant for living, nor was it designed for the dead. Every chamber, every corridor, every shift in elevation had a purpose that extended beyond physical function. At the most basic level, the internal design reflected the same principles as the external form: alignment, resonance, precision. The passages were positioned in relation to specific points in the sky. Shafts extended outward at angles that corresponded to stars of importance, not as they appeared at the time of construction, but as they had appeared in earlier ages. This was not coincidence. It was memory encoded into stone, a deliberate attempt to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. But there was more. At certain points within the pyramid, the structure changed in subtle ways. The materials shifted. The geometry became more refined. The spaces, though still confined, took on a different quality. These were not random variations. They marked transitions, zones within the structure where its function altered. Some of these areas were accessible, others were not. There are indications, drawn from incomplete records and modern exploration, that parts of the pyramid remain unexplored, not because they are impossible to reach, but because their entrances are not obvious. They were not designed to be found easily. Only those who understood the system would know where to look. And even then, access may have required more than physical effort. It may have required alignment, timing, conditions that are not immediately apparent. Among the known chambers, there are features that continue to raise questions. Rooms that appear unfinished, yet are constructed with extraordinary precision. Spaces that resonate in unusual ways when sound is introduced. Areas where the temperature remains constant, regardless of external conditions. These details, while often treated as curiosities, may be essential to understanding the pyramid's function. Because if the structure was designed to interact with forces beyond simple physical mechanics, then its internal environment would play a critical role. Resonance is not limited to sound. It can apply to energy, to frequency, to patterns that exist beyond what human senses can easily detect. If the pyramid was intended to focus or amplify such patterns, then its internal design would need to support that function. The chambers would not be arbitrary. They would be tuned, positioned to create specific conditions, to guide the movement of something intangible. This idea aligns with some of the more speculative theories, that the pyramid acts as a kind of resonant device, a structure that interacts with the earth beneath it and the sky above it, drawing in subtle forces, concentrating them, and directing them toward a focal point. If this is true, then the center of that process would not be visible from the outside. It would be hidden, protected, buried within layers of stone and geometry. There are accounts, rare and often dismissed, that suggest the existence of a chamber deeper than any that has been officially documented, a space not aligned with the known passages, a void within the structure that does not correspond to the visible layout. Modern scanning technologies have hinted at anomalies, empty spaces where there should be none, regions that do not match the expected density of solid stone. These discoveries remain incomplete, open to interpretation, but they raise a possibility that the pyramid contains more than what has been revealed. And if so, then the question becomes critical. What was placed there? The traditional narrative suggests that the pyramid was built as a tomb, a resting place for a ruler. But within the context of everything that has been reconstructed, everything that has been suggested by the patterns, the alignments, and the design, this explanation seems insufficient, too simple, too disconnected from the complexity of the structure itself. If the pyramid was a device, a component of a larger system, then its core would not be empty. It would contain something essential. Not necessarily an object in the conventional sense, but perhaps a mechanism, a focal point, a place where the interactions between earth and sky were concentrated. Some theories propose that this central space may have been used to house materials with specific properties, crystalline structures, metals, elements chosen not for symbolic value, but for their ability to interact with energy in ways not fully understood. Others suggest that the chamber itself, regardless of its contents, was the key, that its shape, its position, and its relationship to the rest of the pyramid created conditions that could not exist elsewhere. Conditions that allowed for something to occur. An activation, a transition, a connection. If such a process existed, it would not have been visible to the general population. It would have been controlled, managed by those who understood its purpose, and perhaps influenced by something beyond human control. There is another detail that cannot be ignored. The pyramid, once completed, was sealed. Not completely, not in a way that prevented all access, but in a manner that limited it, restricted it, as if what lay within was not meant to be disturbed. This raises a question that is rarely asked. If the pyramid was designed to function, why restrict access to its core? One possible answer is that the function did not require constant interaction, that once activated, the system could operate independently. Another possibility is more concerning, that the knowledge required to safely interact with the core was too dangerous to be widely known, that misuse could lead to consequences similar to those that had once destroyed the ancient world. If the builders were aware of this risk, then sealing the structure would not be an act of secrecy alone. It would be a precaution, a way to ensure that what had been created would not be easily altered or misused. And yet, the pyramid was not completely hidden. It stood in plain sight, visible to all, a reminder of something greater, a symbol of connection, but also, perhaps, a warning. Because the true nature of the pyramid was never meant to be fully understood by everyone, only by those who carried the deepest fragments of knowledge, those who could interpret not just its form, but its function. And as time passed, even that knowledge began to fade. The carriers, once central to the system, became fewer, their understanding diluted across generations. The original purpose of the pyramid became obscured, reinterpreted, transformed into something simpler, something that could be explained without referencing the complexities of the past. A tomb, a monument, a symbol of power. But beneath that interpretation, the structure remained unchanged, its alignments still precise, its internal design still intact, its potential, whatever it may have been, still present, waiting. And as the presence in the sky continued, as the visitors observed the world that had rebuilt itself around the pyramid, one final question began to emerge. If the pyramid still functions, even now, then what, exactly, is it still connected to? As generations passed, the original purpose of the pyramid did not disappear. It faded. Not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, as knowledge shifted from precision to interpretation, from understanding to belief. The carriers of memory, once the guardians of deeper knowledge, became fewer. Their teachings, once exact and carefully preserved, began to fragment. Words changed, meanings softened. What had once been instruction became tradition. And within that transition, something critical was at risk of being lost. The warning. Because the pyramid was never only a structure of connection, it was also a structure of memory. Not memory in the human sense, but something more durable, something encoded into its very form. Its angles, its chambers, its alignments were not just functional. They were informational. A message preserved not in language, but in design. A message meant to endure even when all spoken knowledge had faded. The question is not whether the message exists. The question is whether it has been understood. At first, the warning was not obvious. It was not written plainly, not expressed in symbols that could be easily interpreted. It required knowledge of the system, an understanding of the patterns that the pyramid was built to reflect. Only then could its deeper meaning begin to emerge. Those who still carried fragments of the original knowledge began to notice inconsistencies. Not errors, not flaws, but deliberate deviations. Subtle variations in alignment that did not match the expected patterns. Angles that seemed slightly altered. Measurements that, at first glance, appeared precise, but upon deeper examination revealed intentional irregularities. These were not mistakes. They were signals, markers placed within the structure itself. And when interpreted correctly, they pointed to something beyond the pyramid, to the sky, to specific configurations of stars, but not as they appeared in the present, as they would appear at a different time. A future alignment. This is where the warning begins to take shape, because the pyramid does not only reflect the past, it anticipates the future. Embedded within its design are references to cycles far longer than a single human life, movements of the Earth that shift the position of stars over thousands of years, patterns that repeat, but only after vast periods of time. And within those cycles, there are moments of significance, moments when alignments return, moments when the relationship between Earth and sky reaches a specific state. According to some interpretations, these moments are not neutral. They are points of vulnerability, times when the system, if active, could become unstable, times when the same forces that once contributed to the collapse of the ancient world could return. If the pyramid was built as part of a reconstructed network, then it would not be immune to the same risks. It would be connected, responsive, and during certain alignments, potentially unstable. This possibility changes the meaning of the structure entirely. It is no longer just a device. It is a record of what happened before, and a guide for what might happen again. But the warning does not stop there. There are indications that the internal design of the pyramid reflects not just a single cycle, but multiple layers of alignment, each corresponding to different points in time, some closer, some far beyond the era in which the pyramid was built. This suggests that the builders were aware of long-term patterns, that they understood the system they were working with was not static. It evolved, shifted, and could reach states that were either stable or unstable depending on its configuration. If this knowledge was preserved intentionally, then the pyramid becomes something else. A map. Not of geography, but of time. A guide that could be used to predict when certain conditions would arise and perhaps how to prepare for them. But there is a problem. The knowledge required to interpret this map has been largely lost. The carriers who once understood the deeper layers of the system are no longer present in the same way. Their teachings have been diluted, altered, or forgotten. What remains are fragments, clues that are difficult to connect, and without the full context, the warning becomes difficult to recognize. It exists, but it is hidden. Not by design alone, but by time. There are other elements within the pyramid that support this idea, features that seem unnecessary for a simple structure, but make sense within the context of a message. Passages that align with specific stars only during certain periods. Chambers that resonate differently depending on environmental conditions. Measurements that correspond to mathematical constants related to cycles of time. Individually, these details can be dismissed. Collectively, they form a pattern that suggests intention, and that intention points toward preservation, not of objects, not of bodies, but of knowledge, a knowledge that was too important to risk being lost again. And yet, even with this effort, the message did not remain clear. As the society around the pyramid evolved, as rulers rose and fell, as belief systems transformed, the interpretation of the structure continued to change. The idea of the pyramid as a tomb became dominant. The deeper meaning, the functional aspect, the encoded warning, all of it receded into the background. Not erased, but overshadowed. This may not have been entirely accidental, because knowledge of a warning carries consequences. It introduces uncertainty. It challenges authority. It raises questions that are difficult to answer. And in a society that depends on stability, such questions can be dangerous. It is possible that the deeper knowledge was intentionally restricted, not destroyed, but limited to a small group, preserved in secrecy, protected from misinterpretation, or from misuse. But secrecy has its own risks. Over time, even those who protect knowledge can lose parts of it. Details fade, connections weaken, and eventually what remains is no longer complete. This may be what happened to the warning. It survived, but not in a form that could be easily understood. Today, the pyramid still stands, its structure unchanged, its alignments intact, its message still present, waiting to be interpreted. Modern tools have begun to uncover details that were not visible before, measurements that reveal hidden precision, scans that suggest undiscovered spaces, analyses that point to mathematical relationships embedded within its design. But these discoveries are only fragments, pieces of a larger puzzle. And without the original framework, without the context that once gave them meaning, they remain incomplete. The warning is still there, but it is silent, encoded in stone, waiting for someone to see it not as a monument of the past, but as a message meant for the future. And as the cycles of the earth and sky continue, as the alignments shift slowly over time, one possibility becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. What if the moment the pyramid was designed to warn about is not in the distant past, but still ahead? As centuries turned into millennia, the pyramid remained, unchanged, silent, enduring through the rise and fall of kingdoms, the shifting of beliefs, and the slow erosion of memory. Empires came and went, languages evolved, knowledge was gained, lost, and rediscovered in fragments. But the deeper truth behind the pyramid did not reemerge, not fully, because it was never simply forgotten. It was buried, not beneath sand or stone, but beneath layers of interpretation, control, and deliberate silence. After the height of the civilization along the Nile, something began to shift once again. The clarity that had once guided the carriers of knowledge continued to fade. Their role diminished, replaced by structured hierarchies that valued authority over understanding. Knowledge became power, and power seeks control. The deeper aspects of what the pyramid represented were no longer widely shared. They were restricted, confined to small groups whose purpose was not only to preserve information, but to manage it, to decide what could be known and what could not. This transition did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually as generations passed and the original intent of the pyramid became less immediate, less relevant to the daily lives of the people. For most, the explanation was simple. The pyramid was a tomb, a monument to the divine authority of kings, a symbol of permanence in a world of change. This narrative was effective. It provided clarity, it reinforced structure, and, most importantly, it removed complexity. Because the true nature of the pyramid was not simple, it was not easily explained, and it carried implications that could not be easily controlled. If the pyramid was a device, a system connected to something beyond the earth, then those who understood it held a form of influence that extended beyond human society. They held access to something unknown, and that is not something power structures allow to remain uncontrolled. So the knowledge was divided, simplified for the many, preserved in fragments for the few, hidden within layers of ritual, symbol, and coded language that only a small number could interpret. These groups did not present themselves openly. They did not declare their purpose, but their influence can be traced through patterns that appear across different civilizations, through similarities in symbols that should not have been connected, through the persistence of certain ideas that refuse to disappear completely. The idea of hidden knowledge, of truths reserved for those who are prepared to understand them, of a connection between earth and sky that goes beyond simple observation. As time moved forward, these fragments spread, carried by migration, trade, conquest, absorbed into new cultures, adapted, reinterpreted, but never entirely erased. In some traditions, the beings from the sky remained present as gods. In others, they became distant creators. In still others, they were forgotten entirely, replaced by new systems of belief. But beneath these variations, the pattern remained. A memory of something beyond the human, something that had once interacted directly with the earth, something that may still be connected. As knowledge evolved in other parts of the world, new systems emerged: philosophy, science, observation driven by method rather than memory. These developments brought clarity to many aspects of the natural world, but they also introduced skepticism, a tendency to dismiss what could not be measured or explained within established frameworks. This shift further obscured the deeper layers of the pyramid's purpose, because without context, without the fragments of knowledge that once supported its interpretation, the structure appeared to be exactly what it seemed: a remarkable achievement of engineering, a symbol of an ancient civilization, nothing more. And yet, anomalies remained. Questions that did not have simple answers, precision that exceeded what was expected, alignments that suggested intention beyond aesthetics or symbolism. These details were noted, studied, debated, but often they were isolated, examined individually rather than as part of a larger system. And in that isolation, their significance was diminished. Because the true nature of the pyramid cannot be understood by looking at it alone. It must be seen in relation to everything that came before it: the lost civilization, the network of structures, the patterns in the sky, the fragments of knowledge carried through generations. Without that context, the pyramid becomes an artifact. With it, it becomes something else, a piece of a much larger design. As modern exploration advanced, new tools began to reveal more. Internal scans suggested hidden spaces. Mathematical analysis uncovered relationships embedded within its dimensions. Astronomical studies confirmed alignments that could not be easily dismissed. Each discovery added to the mystery, but also to the hesitation. Because the more complex the pyramid appeared, the more difficult it became to fit within conventional explanations. And so, interpretations remained cautious, limited, careful not to extend beyond what could be definitively proven. This caution is understandable, but it also has a consequence. It prevents certain questions from being fully explored, questions that challenge the boundaries of current understanding, questions that connect the pyramid not just to human history, but to something beyond it. There are those who believe that this hesitation is not entirely natural, that the suppression of deeper inquiry is not only a result of scientific caution, but of something more deliberate. A continuation of the pattern that began long ago. The control of knowledge. The management of what is allowed to be understood. This idea is difficult to prove, but it is not without precedent. Throughout history, knowledge has often been restricted, not always for malicious reasons, but often to maintain stability, to prevent disruption, to control the narrative. If the pyramid represents a connection to something beyond the Earth, something that could alter our understanding of reality itself, then it would not be surprising if that knowledge were treated carefully, or even concealed, because the implications are significant. They challenge the idea that humanity developed in isolation. They suggest that the course of history may have been influenced by forces not entirely of this world. They raise the possibility that the systems built in the past were not just symbolic, but functional. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they imply that those systems may still exist, still function, still connect to something beyond our current understanding. If that is true, then the pyramid is not just a relic, it is an active element, part of a system that has never been fully deactivated. And if the warning encoded within it refers to cycles that have yet to complete, then the implications extend beyond the past. They reach into the present and the future. As we stand in a time of increasing knowledge, with tools capable of exploring deeper than ever before, the question becomes more urgent. Not whether the pyramid holds secrets, but whether we are ready to uncover them. Because some truths, once revealed, cannot be ignored. They cannot be simplified. They cannot be contained within existing frameworks. And they may require a fundamental shift in how we understand our place in the universe. The truth was never meant to be easily known, not because it was hidden by accident, but because it carries weight, responsibility, and consequence. And as we move closer to the present, as the cycles continue and the patterns align once more, one final layer of the mystery begins to emerge. Not about what happened in the past, but about what has been happening all along. Because if the knowledge was never completely lost, then someone, somewhere, has always been watching, always remembering, always waiting for the moment when the truth can no longer remain hidden. The pyramid still stands. Through wind and time, through the shifting of empires and the quiet passing of centuries, it has remained. Its surface worn, its outer casing long stripped away, yet its form unchanged, its alignment intact, its presence undeniable. To most, it is a monument of the past. To a few, it is something else. Because the story does not end with its construction. It never did. What was built along the Nile was not simply a structure to mark a moment in history. It was part of a system designed to endure beyond the lifespan of any civilization. A system that could persist even as knowledge faded, even as meanings were lost and reinterpreted. And at the center of that system was a single idea: connection. Not a symbolic connection, a real one, subtle, difficult to detect, but present. From the moment the pyramid was completed, from the moment its alignments were fixed and its internal structure sealed, something began to operate. Not continuously, not in a way that could be easily measured, but in cycles. Moments of activity followed by long periods of silence. A pattern that mirrors the movements of the sky itself. This is the final layer of the mystery. The possibility that the pyramid is not dormant, that it has never truly been inactive, that what was created thousands of years ago continues to function, even now. There are no obvious signs, no visible energy, no sound that can be heard by the human ear. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, because if the system was designed to operate beyond ordinary perception, then its activity would not be obvious. It would be hidden, integrated into the natural rhythms of the earth, masked by the very patterns it interacts with. There are moments, however, when the silence seems to shift. Moments when the environment behaves in ways that are difficult to fully explain. Subtle anomalies, variations in electromagnetic fields, unusual readings that appear and disappear without clear cause. These observations are often dismissed, attributed to natural variation, instrument error, coincidence. And perhaps they are. But taken together, they form a pattern that suggests something is still occurring, something periodic. Something tied not to human activity, but to larger cycles. Cycles of the earth, cycles of the sky. If the pyramid was designed to respond to specific alignments, then its activity would not be constant. It would be triggered, activated only when certain conditions are met, when the positions of celestial bodies reach a particular configuration, when the relationship between earth and sky matches a state encoded within the structure itself. This would explain the silence, the long stretches of apparent inactivity, and the rare, subtle moments when something seems to change. But if this is true, then a more important question emerges. What happens during those moments of activation? The answer may not be something that can be observed directly. It may not produce visible effects. Instead, it may involve processes that operate at levels beyond human perception. Transmission, reception, exchange. The pyramid may not be a source. It may be a node, a point within a larger network, a network that extends beyond the earth. If that network still exists, if it was never fully dismantled after the fall of the ancient world, then the pyramid could still be part of it, still sending, still receiving, still connected to something far beyond its physical form. This brings us back to the visitors, the beings that were once described as gods, the observers, the influencers, the ones who may have guided, divided, and ultimately withdrawn. If the pyramid functions as a signal, then it is not just broadcasting into empty space. It is reaching something, or waiting for something to respond. There is a possibility that the signal has never stopped, that it has been repeating cycle after cycle for thousands of years. A constant call, a marker of presence, a declaration that humanity reached a certain point, that it rebuilt, that it remembered enough to reconnect. If that signal is still active, then it raises a profound question. Who is listening? And perhaps more importantly, have they already answered? The absence of obvious contact does not mean absence of response. If the interaction operates on levels beyond direct perception, then its effects may be subtle, integrated into the development of knowledge, the direction of discovery, the evolution of understanding. It is possible that influence does not appear as intervention, but as guidance, as ideas that emerge without clear origin, as breakthroughs that seem to arrive at the right moment, as if something is shaping the path without revealing itself. This idea is difficult to accept. It challenges the concept of independent development. It suggests that humanity may not be entirely alone in its progress. But it also aligns with patterns that have been observed throughout history, moments of sudden advancement, periods where knowledge seems to accelerate, as if something shifts, something aligns, and new possibilities become accessible. If the pyramid is part of a system that interacts with such processes, then its influence may extend far beyond its physical location. It may not need to be understood to function. It may not need to be acknowledged to have an effect. It simply operates, according to rules that were established long ago, rules that may not have been created by humans alone. As we move forward in time, as technology advances and exploration reaches further into space, the context of the pyramid begins to change. It is no longer just an ancient structure. It becomes a point of reference, a reminder that the idea of connection between Earth and sky is not new, that it has been explored before, perhaps more deeply than we currently realize. And as we begin to send our own signals into the cosmos, as we search for signs of other intelligence, we may be repeating a process that started long before recorded history. The difference is that now we are aware of what we are doing. Or at least, we believe we are. But awareness does not guarantee understanding. And if the pyramid still functions, if its signal still echoes through cycles of time, then it is possible that we are not the first to ask the question. We are simply the latest, standing in the shadow of something that has been reaching outward for thousands of years, waiting, not for discovery, but for recognition. Because the final truth may not be hidden within the pyramid. It may not be buried in stone or encoded in its angles. It may be something far simpler and far more unsettling. The signal was never meant to call something to Earth. It was meant to announce that something had already been here, that the connection was never broken, only forgotten. And as long as the pyramid stands, as long as its alignment holds and its structure endures, that signal continues. Quiet, unseen, but constant, echoing through time, waiting for the moment when humanity finally understands what it has been trying to say all along. If you've made it this far, then you've walked through one of the oldest mysteries humanity has ever tried to understand. A story buried beneath stone, a signal hidden in silence, a question that still echoes beyond the stars. Here, on Forbidden Lore, we don't just tell stories. We uncover what history tried to forget. So if this journey made you wonder, if it made you question what we've been told, or if a part of you feels like there's something more waiting to be discovered, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to Forbidden Lore. Like this video to support the channel, and stay with us, because this is only the beginning. There are more secrets, more lost histories, more truths hidden just beneath the surface of everything we think we know. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never ignore what the silence might be hiding.